past the hour, I think we'll go ahead and kick off. So I feel like I've introduced myself too many times already, but I don't think everyone got to hear it. So really good to see everybody here on the Zoom webinar. My name is Eileen Burbage. I'm the Executive Director at Fertifa, and I'm really, really pleased to be joined by Celine, who I'll give a minute to introduce herself as well, to talk specifically today about, although honestly, we're happy to chat about whatever is on all of your minds. Celine and I are people who are not shy to talk about anything, so feel free to check anything our way. But the reason we invited you all for this conversation and what we're really looking forward to talking about today is specifically 4 key things to think about before drafting a women's health policy for your workplace. So that's our topic. I've introduced myself enough, and I would love for Celine to introduce herself as well. We're both wearing our Fertifa hoodies, so you'll see that we're quite familiar with one another, but that means we're really looking forward to having a really fun conversation and hopefully a really informative one as well. And no worries about the settings or if people are going to stay off camera. If people do want to speak, we're happy to hand over the mic, which we have the ability to do here in Zoom. We also have, from a housekeeping point of view, the session being recorded. So if there's any part of it that you miss out or your connection drops, we will definitely be sending the recording around after the fact. We also have a Q&A function that's been enabled, as well as a chat function. So please do feel free to make use of all of the above, because we do want to hear from you. And with that, would love for you to introduce yourself, please, Celine.
Thank you, Eileen. So hi, everyone. I'm Celine Crawford. I run the people and operations side of Fertifa. I joined sometime last year, and it's been a very exciting journey for me being part of this company because I've been a chief people officer over the last decade. However, I've also had, challenges with reproductive health. So hopefully you'll agree this gives me a unique position to share experiences, but also practical thoughts from an HR perspective and make for a good discussion today. So really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Celine. She's being modest, but she has been the chief people officer of organizations that are large and small and everything in between. And so I think one of the things we'll definitely touch on is, when is it too early, or when is it appropriate to introduce a women's health policy? You might not be surprised to hear that we have a pretty strong view about that being sort of always, but I'm sure that's one of the things we can touch on. So thanks so much, Celine. It's actually really fun for me personally to be on this webinar with you, even though we are probably overly familiar. This is the first time Celine and I are doing a webinar together. We usually sort of split them up and are speaking to others that are maybe external to the organization, whether they're clients of ours, partners, or otherwise. This is going to be great because obviously we do rely on one another quite a lot internally in terms of what we do for people at Fertifa, but also what we advise our clients to as well. So I think this will be a great conversation. But as I've hopefully already underscored before, please do ask us questions along the way. If we start to touch on something but then swerve off course, please feel free to make a note of that and say, I want to go back to something else, or actually, given that you touched on this, could you please come back and speak a bit more about something else? So please make use of the Q&A and the chat functions. Maybe as a way to start using some of these interactive features within Zoom, do we want to start with a poll, Celine? What do you think? Just to sort of see what's on people's minds.
Absolutely. We love talking about reproductive health, and we also love data. So why not start with a poll, which I will launch right now. So hopefully you can see this. The question is, does your organization have a women's health policy in place? So if you would take a few seconds to answer, yes, no, it's okay if you're not sure. And then we can have an idea as to who's here today. So the majority, interestingly, so far is no, 64%. There are a few yeses, so I'd love to chat to those people as to what's been included in their policies. What do you think, Eileen, of these numbers?
Absolutely. I think those that have one in place, please chip in then, because not only will that be useful to others on the webinar who, as you see, 2/3 of don't have anything in place, but it should complement what Celine and I sort of have as opinions. So we really want to lean on your input as well, and contributions, please. Really interesting, I think, that just as many aren't sure that do, because that's actually not problematic as such, but that's worrisome because maybe they do, but if you don't know about it, it's just as useful or not useful as not having one in place, right?
What's better is that we've had 100% people answer, so that's really great participation. Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and end the poll now. Thank you.
Okay, super. So given that as a sort of framing, and knowing that 2/3 of the respondents and those that are on the webinar said that they don't have a women's health policy in place, then of the remaining third, half do, but half didn't know. What do you think, kind of, given your many different turns as a chief people officer and an HR, dealing with people issues, why would you say, personally and professionally to you, Celine, why does having a women's health policy actually matter?
I mean, that is the crux of the question. I think a women's health policy is really important because you want your employees to be happy and productive and feel supported in their journey with your company. And women's health covers a range of health challenges, some of which you may know about, some of which you may not know about. But at the end of the day, your employees will be going through these challenges whether you have a policy or not. So we at Fertifa think it's really important to have those policies in place, not only for people to read, but also to help educate ourselves and people in the company as to these different, journeys and challenges that people may go through so that we can have a happy and productive workforce.
Thank you. I also think there are some even more subtle points, aren't there? There's a signaling effect, don't you think? And I don't mean sort of gratuitous, I don't know, sort of, washing, whatever the appropriate term would be, or just performative. But, as we're going to talk about, there are meaningful considerations in putting together a useful women's health policy. And I think for me anyway, thinking about an organization that's taken the time to do that, for me would reflect that that might be the type of organization that is inclusive or considerate or has thought about these kinds of things. So I'm going to start or kick off with maybe a controversial question, which I think is a natural one. You've just talked about the reasons why you think it's important to have a women's health policy in place. Is it then not obvious, therefore, to also have a men's health policy in place?
I think it's very important to have a men's health policy in place as well. I think we talk about this a lot. Obviously, if you have a policy in place, you want it to be a living and breathing document that's evolving with the company, and you want it to be lived from, the top down of the organization. So that's one key that's really important. But if you are looking to go to the deepest levels of having policies, it is very worthwhile to separate your policies and have a men's health policy as well as a women's health policy. So again, going back to the education point and general support point, you can help people understand what they might be going through. I mean, we know more and more employees are going to their employers rather than to their GP or the NHS to find out information. And so I feel as an HR professional, as a people team, and as leaders of a company, we have a responsibility to get to know more about these issues as well.
Okay, that's helpful. That makes a lot of sense. And I think we're going to touch upon this a little bit later, I know, because I obviously have a sneak peek about the 4 things we're going to highlight. But when we talk about then those 2 different policies living in concert, for women's health policy, just a point about language, we are in this context talking about anyone with a uterus, really, right? Or can experience what are typically women's health issues relating to a sort of a female reproductive health system. And so again, this will come up later, I think, when we talk about inclusivity, language, and the like. But I just thought it was worth sort of flagging that. And again, for those that responded to the poll and have policies already in place, great to hear how you've sort of addressed that. If you approached it differently, if your presuppositions for putting the policy in place were different as in terms of reasons or why important than what Celine said, please let us know.
Yeah. Just to add to that, I think it is such an important point, and even us at Fertifa, despite the fact that we are experts, we work with experts around these topics, we know that we have to be open and listen to feedback as to the language and the terminology that we use. So we know that we don't always get it right, and I think that's such an important point. And I'd be really interested to hear people's experiences around how their policies may have evolved because of that.
Great. It's kind of a shame, but it's probably also very fair that we couldn't see who responded which way. So we can't call people out specifically, but we're hopefully repeating our invitations for people to give us comments. So with all of that then established, shall we, do I get to sort of unveil the very first of the 4 key points, or do you want to go for it? What's the first thing you would say is to consider before putting a women's health policy in place?
I think it's really understanding about, the types of challenges that women might go through, and giving, more information, more data around the different experiences that women could have, whether they have I can't say the word and I went for it, gynecological health issues or endometriosis or PCOS, or all these ranges of challenges, is trying to understand what does that actually mean in practice? How is that actually going to affect them? So I think a really good place to start is to discuss the common health challenges that might happen. So I don't know if you want to start with that, Eileen, but we know that 1/3 of women experience severe kind of health problems, and it can range from having mild symptoms to debilitating symptoms. So it is very important to understand how this affects people.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. I mean, we could probably list all the stats, and I know it's coming, everybody's sort of sick of hearing about that, but that's the other point, and I like that you mentioned we're talking about gynecological topics. They don't necessarily have to be, the big topics of family forming, of becoming a parent, of, infertility challenges, of menopause, even though obviously we would sort of suggest it should cover all of these things. We're even talking about, menstrual cycle, period pain, normal periods. We know that on average, women can take 9 days off or lose 9 days off of productivity a year from work because of it. And I guess relating to this, talk about sort of the big ticket topics as well as the sort of everyday or the normal topics. Somebody has kindly sort of put in a point here, which I think is a great place to, or it's a great time to acknowledge it. A lot of individuals at work might find it hard to talk about these topics, even if they're everyday, or especially if they're everyday, particularly if they're debilitating, or if they're these kind of big life-changing topics. They might find it hard to talk about this with their employer, with their chief people officer, their HR representative, their people partner. And so how would you try to bypass the taboo, or, make it less uncomfortable for people?
That's a really important question. And there isn't a one size fits all answer, because it might be different for different individuals. So some people might be more comfortable if, let's say, they see the leadership team of an organization talking about it more openly. Some people might relate more to having a guest speaker come in and asking questions in an anonymous way or in a live way. Other people just want to read the policy and want to have a really good terminology at the end where they can get their information, or links to resources. So we all learn in different ways, and so I think it's important to acknowledge that, within the policy, acknowledge the differences in our ways of learning and ways of feeling comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even sort of a step 0 to that is, as you've just been talking about, normalizing the conversation, right? Whether that's through external experts or senior leaders in the organization, or through having the policy in place. That's sort of the first step. And so again, in terms of having the policy in place, hopefully that makes it less of a taboo, because there's a policy alongside all of the other policies that would apply to the organization. And again, maybe that brings some comfort or a bit of security, or at least a sense of safety for individuals to have the conversation. Hopefully that helped answer that individual's question. Another question, I guess. Oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say what you were saying before about people who may have said that they're not sure if they have a policy in place. I think if you do have a policy, it's such a great opportunity to open a conversation with people in your organization, whether it is simply by getting a focus group together to get feedback for people who are really interested in the subject matter, where it's just a general, explaining how the policy works. I think the more open you are and the more feedback you get, then the more engagement you will have, and the more normalizing the conversations will become.
Super. And again, we're talking about these 4 key points of, to consider before putting in a women's health policy in place. And that first one was to really recognize the breadth of all the different experiences. Do you have any advice for HR professionals who may not have gone through reproductive health, situation, and clearly it's unlikely that someone's going to have gone through all of them, what's the best way for an HR professional to get a bit of exposure or visibility to all of the things that could or should be mentioned or covered or encompassed in a policy?
Well, obviously, I'm gonna say you should download our template on women's health policy, because that will give you a good view as to what kind of challenges people might have. So I think you mentioned endometriosis. There's also PCOS and other conditions that people can learn about. People can partner with companies, like Fertifa, to get better education. There's great resources on the NHS. So there's different ways to start to get it right. I guess what I would say is, don't be afraid to get it wrong, but get started. I think sometimes people are very worried that they're going to get something wrong, and so they opt to, for inaction. And I think a lot of experiences speaking to our clients, speaking to other HR professionals, get it wrong, but get started, and you'll get it right eventually.
It's that saying, isn't it? Perfect being the enemy of progress, or I'm probably going to make a hash of that. But yeah, no, getting started. And even if one's not getting started actually writing the policy, get started with the conversations, right?
Yes.
I would have even said, chat with your people and ask them, do an engagement survey, do an employee survey, ask them what they've gone through, right? What they kind of wish to be
Absolutely.
covered.
It's so important to understand your population, and a lot of people go through these things in silence, and so I think even if it's anonymous or not anonymous, some people are okay to be attributed. Getting to understand what people are going through gives you a great place to start, especially because a lot of questions we get as a follow-up question is, how do I get buy-in from my leadership team, how I get this implemented? So if you have data of people that are working for you, it's a great place to get the conversation going, at least.
Okay, super. So that first point of the four was to understand and recognize the breadth of all of the experiences, or all of the women's health issues and challenges that individuals could experience. What would then be the second point?
So the second point, which is a really important point, is around the practicalities, right? So I have the desire of putting a policy in place, and what does the policy include? What should it look like? What should the tone have? What are the practicalities that not only employees would have to go through, but also HR managers, or managers themselves? And so there's several things that we can talk about here. And I think what's challenging sometimes for people is to try and figure out, let's say very simply, the first question, how many days should we be giving for people for women's health challenges? I think at Fertifa, we always say that everybody is different. And even though, we gave a little bit of a guideline for endometriosis, for example, we know that some people can take up to 20 days a year as a sick day. So that's quite a large number, whilst others might only need a couple of days. So it can be quite difficult to, come up with a number. And I think that's very personal to a company, to what they can afford, and, what they think is right for them. But that's the place to start, is to give people clarity and understanding as to what they are entitled to.
Okay, super. So not only the entitlement and what's sort of included, but we probably also want what signposts, like, where can people go, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
basically how to approach the conversation to the other person's question, which is how to make sure that people feel comfortable having these conversations if they feel it's a taboo topic. So it's kind of almost a playbook of how to unpack that or overcome that.
Yes. And I think in a very basic way is even deciding, where are your policies going to live? Are they going to live in your employee handbook? Are they going to live in your induction pack? Are they going to, because, there's different approaches to this. Do you have an intranet? Do you have an internal wiki that you want to post them in? But, whatever you decide, make sure that people know where to find them. Because I think as a first port, people like to go and explore and read the policy and understand. And to complete that point about speaking to someone as a second step, even though your policy might say, go speak to your manager or someone in HR, somebody might be more comfortable speaking to other people. So depending on the breadth of your organization, you may want to have champions or ambassadors for specific, topics that you can signpost to, or people just go to whomever they feel most comfortable. And this is why the education piece is so important. It's not just for, HR people and, the leadership team. It's really for the organization as a whole.
Sure, makes sense. And then somebody's chipping in, thank you again for the contribution, that, because you talked about these practicalities. It's basically the who, what, when, where, what, how to really get into these things. And this person is pointing out, number of days, the allowance, the entitlement is a really gray area and can be very individual. It's obviously going to be dependent on the individual, their role, maybe their tenure, maybe exactly what they're going through. So they've mentioned this concept of adjustment passports, and wondering if you might be able to just offer a few words on that. As a non-HR professional, I actually haven't heard that term before. Do you see them commonly or not? And how do you think that can be applied?
I think adjustments passports are a really good way. There's different ways that they can, be used in practice. So something that people do is maybe come up with a minimum number of days that people can take. And then if they want to go above and beyond that day, they can come up with, let's say, a personal plan. So let's say a personal plan as to how they need to navigate a specific challenge that they can write with their HR manager. And it's not always number of days that is the most important, right? Sometimes they might need a flexible working arrangement. They might need to adjust their working hours. They might need to adjust their, home setup. It might take different guises. And so as long as you're opening up that conversation, and either through a personal plan, a passport, whatever you want to call it, even a reasonable adjustment for whatever that is, as long as the dialogue is open, that is the important first step in understanding how to support someone going through this.
So I think a common theme we're already coming up with is, as you said, there's not one size fits all. And so a lot of, again, what we're talking about are the 4 key points to think about before putting a policy in place. And I think that recognition or acknowledgement is the very first thing. Nothing's going to be quite cookie cutter. And so, the first point that we spoke about was to consider the breadth of or at least focus on the most common experiences we think women are going to go through. The second point, that being the practicalities of it. And I think sounds like you just really eloquently said, flexibility is really important, but maybe put in parameters, sort of, minimum, at least, a range. This is how you go about finding out more, that kind of thing. Just a starting point, isn't it?
Yes, and I think, the starting point is important because we always talk about having flexible policies, but you don't want them to be vague. So there's quite a thin line between being vague and flexible. And so as long as you have a starting point for people to understand what they can do, and being very specific. Is this paid? Is this unpaid? How do they book it? Do they go into their HR system? Is it booked as sick leave? Is it booked as other absence? You will know, depending on how you work with people practically, how this will, be implemented. But it is important to spell it out for people, because, they're going through a challenging time. They don't want to be, they want it to be quite clear as to, what the path is. And so that's really helpful, as much as possible, to spell out what the direction is for them to navigate this.
Yeah, for sure. The last thing individuals would want is sort of additional uncertainty, because it's just sort of like, don't even go there. So that's a really useful way to explain it. Thank you. So then recapping, the first one was think about the most common women's health challenges employees will be experiencing. Second point was the practicalities of the policy that we've just talked about, the who, what, when, where, why. What's the third point then of the 4 key takeaways?
I think it's also where a bit more about where to find the support, because I think that will be very different within different organizations. I think different organizations might have different types of support. So someone might be going through a reproductive health challenge, but they could also get access to mental health support in the company. So really try to explain to your employees how your policies are intertwined, and what they get access to. Maybe you have, insurance, a cash plan. Maybe you're working with someone like for TIFA, and obviously we know that also varies in terms of the level of access that people can get. So really explaining the different levels of access, I think, is also critical.
You're right. Sorry, I was trying to push ahead with the third point, but that's still on the second point about the practicalities. There's really a lot to consider with the practicalities. It's also, like you said, other things that might be available, right? So other things that complement might not be directly in the women's health sort of policy itself or the provision itself, but where else employees can go, what they can turn to, what's available for support. And also just in general, sort of the extent to which the organization wants to be able to support, whether it's through their own people partners or HR or other teams, or if it's going to be through other provision. Now, can we skip ahead? Am I pushing too far? We'll go to the third point. What's then the third key point to consider before putting a women's health policy in place?
So one of the most key points that we always talk about at Fertifa is making sure that you have an inclusive policy, right? So, you can have the best policy in the world, but if it doesn't take into account everyone in your population or every way that people can experience something, then it's not a great policy. So there's different ways to make sure that a policy is inclusive. But I think you mentioned it at the beginning as well, is really understanding the terms that we're working with. So as we said here, for women's health, it would be meaningful of the fact that it's for employees with a uterus, no matter their gender identity. So I think it is really important to mention that as an example.
And if we're talking about inclusivity, what's the best way to include partners, or whether they're male, female, other, within the organization, colleagues or not? How do we incorporate sort of line managers? Would that come under this sort of point of yours?
I think so. I think it's really important to understand that in women's health specifically, that sometimes the person that needs support might not be the person going through the challenge, but a partner supporting someone else going through the challenge. So being cognizant of that fact is, I think, extremely inclusive. And again, it will depend on each organization as to what they're prepared to give. But I think opening up the conversation for you might have a partner whose other partner is going through severe challenges and needs to be working from home more to support them. So it might not be a case of paid leave or things like that, but just again an accommodation of more flexibility. And the more we can understand how to support people, then the better off both parties will be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also think as part of this whole point about inclusivity, it is just making sure that, again, people don't feel left out of the conversation, right? And that the the vocabulary that's being used makes it really clear that's applicable. And then also just the policy itself. One thing I'm really, really proud of, that we've had some great partnerships at Fertifa is we have organizations that make sure that the support is available to all their colleagues, even if, say, for example, they're in the retail sector. And you might have individuals who are head office versus those that are field based or within the store. And I think historically you would have seen maybe different types of benefits, different structures for different types of cohorts within an organization. But I think for women's health, at least as a policy, my view would be inclusivity would mean, and maybe there are different entitlements to different, if you've got different comp structures for different groups within the organization, but then making sure the women's health policy covers or at least clarifies what is available for different groups. Would you agree?
Yeah. I 100% agree. Again, it goes back to the point of clarity, and as clear as possible is best. I think also involving the organization. I know it's not always possible to the nth degree, but having ERG groups, which I think we've mentioned initially, or just general focus groups to get feedback. Even with our own policies like men's health, which we're launching next week. We have ERG with the men in our company just to get feedback, because we have to ask. We can't assume that we know everything. And I think it's important that the companies feel, the employees feel involved in the company and the policies, and its success ultimately, because we're doing this to retain people, to support people, and to have happy, productive people working for us.
Super, thank you. Anything else you want to add on the point of inclusivity more generally? Otherwise, are you ready to reveal point four? Oh, there's always
I,
something
yeah,
else.
I mean, if you ask me that, I'll always have something to
There
say.
is always something
Well,
else.
I'm just thinking of, really fast-growing companies. The population can change quite quickly, and you might not realize it, right? So, for example, you might suddenly go into other, countries. You might go, more remote. You might suddenly have more parents working for you, or, whatever that might be. I think it is important to like regularly survey people in your company to understand what's important to them, rather than just doing the policy, putting it in the drawer, and then it's not really looked at for a really long time. So yeah, I just wanted to make that final point that it's important to revisit what's written, and we definitely do that often at Fertifa as well. Even if it's to tweak it slightly, we get knowledge, experience from people, and make sure we're adding more information to it. Is really important.
That's a great point. Like you say, it's a living document. It also needs to evolve as the organization evolves. And so you mentioned, for example, the size or the state of an organization and the group that it's meant to apply to. I was also thinking when you're talking about that, people might start to have people in other countries or jurisdictions. And so maybe a policy that would be appropriate for a group that's entirely UK based would be very different if there were, folks in other regions in other parts of the world. And so, yeah, you sort of would recommend what an annual kind of a review or a refresh, I guess, alongside other policies, is that right?
Yes, I think so. I think, it depends on how the company wants to structure themselves. Do they have a centralized HR department? Do they go more localized? It will really depend on the organization. It will depend on the workforce. Is it people that work in a factory in another country versus, development teams in Poland, for example, or other countries. So it depends of your makeup. But I think, yes, annually is a good cadence, and making sure that you understand, what people need, depending on where they are, how their working hours are, what their job is. And you won't really know that unless you ask.
Okay. And then are we ready for the reveal for the very last one? So again, we're talking about 4 points. And also, if people, especially those who have already introduced policies in their workplaces, think that we maybe limit it to few by saying these are the 4 key points before putting a women's health policy in place. If people have other points that they want to mention that they also took into consideration, if they think four is too many, we're open and happy to take all of that feedback. But with what you'd already been thinking, Celine, what's the fourth key point? And I am actually going to share then the recap in the group chat.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, the fourth point for us is how does this women's health policy fit in with other policies that you may have? And there's different ways to think about it. Obviously, we think that it's very good to have any policy in place. So if you have a policy that encompasses everything instead of separate policies, that's still a good starting point. Having said that, because some challenges can be very different and very specific, we choose to separate, for example, menopause away from the women's health policies, away from the fertility and family forming policies, in the same way that we separate pregnancy loss from fertility, because they have kind of different connotations. So we really recommend that you do that. However, I would love to hear what people have done actually, if people feel in a sharing mood. We also separated our men's health policy, and I think it just helps to keep the conversations very punctual, and very tailored to the subject at hand, and find solutions that fit the groups that are going through these various challenges, rather than putting everything in the same bucket.
Super. And we've mentioned a men's health policy a couple of times now in different contexts, and you've also sort of said one of your first pieces of, or one of your first suggestions, I wouldn't call it advice, is to download the Fertifa sort of template for women's health policy. Yeah, are we possibly, do you think we'll be looking forward to a men's, we share a men's health one?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're just finalizing our men's health policy in time for Men's Health Awareness Week next week. So we will definitely be sharing that. In the meantime, I did promise, and didn't press send. I did put in the chat our women's health policy template. So if you wanted to download it or have a look, please feel free. Give us feedback as well. We want to hear from you. So yes, we actually have a question.
Really good question. So with the, say it's this template or it's a different template, and it's a policy, once somebody's put that policy in place, how do you recommend they communicate it best so that employees know how to access it or get in touch with it?
I think for employees that are joining the company, it's really important that they know from the outset all the policies that the company has. And as part of the onboarding, make sure that they, speak to someone in the people team, get an opportunity to ask questions. Again, this can be in the handbook, this can be in your induction pack or in separate policies pack, whatever you want to do. In my experience, the best way to communicate policies is in different ways. So, making sure that you are sending maybe an email about it, signposting, again, where you can access. I think we mentioned it might be in your wiki, it might be in different places. But I also think it's worthwhile to create, an opportunity to ask questions and discuss. This might be a very short meeting that you have with people. But it's important to go through the different points and communicate it as much as possible, so that people get an opportunity to see it, to understand what it means, and to ask questions.
Super, thank you. And I think lots of people want to find a template, so just sharing it to some of the people who maybe missed the group chat or wanted to see it again, I put it in the Q&A response and the like. And I've also recapped in that chat the top 4 points that we'd said we wanted to emphasize before people put women's health policies in place. We have gotten through those 4. I don't think we've heard somebody suggesting a 5th or a 6th yet. We're still open to that. And I did want to sort of, just mention that given those 4, obviously, we are really quite keen to make sure that people have time to digest and discuss it. But we typically have these conversations for about 45 minutes. We do like to give people time back. And so we are available here for the next, again, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes if people had other points. And there are some more questions coming in, but please take the time to let us know if you think these 4 points are the ones that you would have expected, the ones that you considered, the ones you did consider, or if there were others as well. In the meantime, going to one of the other questions, which is just more general, so not specific to a women's health policy. What do you think, Celine, are other support initiatives that companies or chief people officers should consider alongside a women's health policy, and what's been most effective from your point of view?
So we have seen many guises of this, and I think as much as possible really is the answer. So we really think if you can have support from the form of well-being to menopause to mental health to men's health to women's health, really anything that an employee could go through, in their life. And I think you'll have a more engaged and productive workforce. But I also think that there's probably things that we haven't thought of that our employees are going to tell us about, and that there are great ideas that we can still do. But the ones that I see most often are really linked to, mental health, menopause, family forming, reproductive health, men's health, from a reproductive health standpoint, if that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, of course, that makes perfect sense. And I guess I wouldn't be me if I didn't also do a shameless plug. I think another thing to consider if one's thinking about what types of support, it would be potentially working with somebody or partnering with someone like Fertifa, but it doesn't have to be Fertifa. We obviously have some great peer companies that are also in the sector to help, an organization think about how best to support their colleagues, because we clearly see what comes into us from our client base. We see what questions come up. We see what trends start to become more common or not. And we therefore could be sort of eyes and ears, or at least hopefully a reliable partner to support employees, even if it's not something that's already in place or as part of the original design. So whether it's Fertifa again or another organization, someone that's focusing on general well-being support and maybe navigational advice for all these topics. Again, it wouldn't be me if I didn't sort of mention that. So I think that we wanted to also make sure though, I wanted to make sure I couldn't put you on the spot before I let you go, because I did say we were going to try and go until 45 minutes, and now I've realized I'm going to talk past that. So I'm going to use up all my time. But what would be for you, because I've recapped the 4 key points, what would be the one takeaway you would want people to remember, Celine? Like if there's nothing else that they remembered, if they couldn't remember all 4 of those, is it one of those points or is it something else entirely different when thinking about women's health policies?
Well, the thing I would say is, we want to normalize conversations, and whether you have a policy or not, people will be going through these challenges anyway. So why not open up the topics and making sure that there's a collaboration in figuring out what's best for your employees? And this may be women's health, this may be something else depending on your organization. I would just encourage people to, ask their employees what they think, what they've been through. It could be, as you say, through an engagement survey. It could be a quick poll. You might have Slack and you want to do a quick Slack poll. Whatever it is for you. It might not, doesn't have to be something onerous, but I think take the temperature of the organization and try to understand where to start. It might be in women's health, it might be somewhere else, but get started.
Super. Okay. And before I let you go, sorry, somebody else has asked a question too, wanting to get in the late stage. They've updated a carer's leave policy, and they know that women are 4 times more likely to take on care responsibilities than men in an organization. So would you suggest that that gets added to the women's health policy, or would it be in the carer's policy? Or
I think I would have a separate policy for carers policy, because again, going back to inclusivity, even though we know that women might be more likely to be a carer, I think we want to make sure that we're remembering everyone. And so I would have a separate policy, because I think also the considerations might be different as to what's needed, and I guess the understanding, you know, of the support needed might also be quite different. So I would keep it separate. Yeah, so for the women's health policy, I would really keep it to women's health challenges as we discussed, for example, menstrual, endometriosis, PCOS, etc. And have the fertility one separate, to the menopause and the pregnancy loss one separate, which I, having gone through it myself, I am a big proponent of. And yeah, I would have a separate carers. And actually, this reminds me of my last point. The reason why separating them is helpful is, obviously you can also have different champions, but you will want to supplement with some guides as well. I think that's super useful, whether it's for your managers or other people in the organization that you're using to help champion this. And so, creating a specific guide for a specific topic is easier than just a general guide.
amazing. Thank you. You're getting lots of love, lots of positive feedback. I will go ahead and recap. Based on your facial expression, you can tell me if my sort of playing it back means I completely missed all your points or not. But from what I heard for you was, when we talk about 4 key things to talk about before an organization or an HR team starts to draft their women's health policy, your points were: first, consider the most common women's health challenges, because there's such a breadth, but you want to know what your employees might be experiencing or going through. Second would be, what are the practicalities of the policy? So not only what's the entitlement, what's included, it's also how to access it, how to communicate it, how to make sure people can find it, what other types of support might be available. 3, to really consider how to make it as inclusive as possible, that works for all employees that might be affected. 4, then how does that policy fit in with other policies already in an organization? And then finally, the key takeaway is, whether you write a women's health policy or not, women are going through this. It's happening. And so the key point, I think the TLDR, the sort of one takeaway is, talk to your employees, engage with your population, find out what they think would be most supportive or helpful for them. Is that a good enough recap?
Absolutely. Enough recap, yes.
Super. Maybe an ending note is, because I think you and I both did this, and I think that's one reason we both think this topic is so important, and why we obviously find it so gratifying to be able to work at Pratika. Somebody has asked, because they've heard you reference your personal experience a couple of times, do you then do that when, or would you suggest people do that when they speak to their stakeholders in order to try and get buy-in? Or would you advise you keep your personal experiences out so that people can't be like, well, they're being emotional or something like that?
So I'll speak from the I, which means that, what I think here in my experience might not be applicable to everyone. When I actually speak to stakeholders, I found that using data is the best way to get what I need. If I'm asked directly about my experiences, I'm always open and happy to share. However, when I'm working one-on-one with people or working on the policies themselves, I'm much more vocal about my own experiences, just to help people open up and share what they might have gone through, because it is quite difficult to talk about these things. And it took me a while to get to a place where I can comfortably talk about that as well. So I do appreciate that, and I feel that helps people feel comfortable and create psychological safety.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing your personal experiences, but also your professional experiences in terms of coming up with these four key points for other people to consider when putting together their policies. Really, really appreciate. It was a pleasure for me to get to chat with you about this in this forum. We've never actually had this conversation.
I know. Next time
Actually,
we're gonna revert it. I'll be the one asking the questions.
okay, but you have much more data to your point. You've really got the sort of professional data and the experiences. So thank you so much, Celine.
Thanks,
And
Eileen.
thank you also to the team that helped us prep for this, organize it, let all of you know that it was happening. We really appreciate our marketing and our commercial teams for being able to get the word out. And every single one of you that attended. We know that your time is precious. There's always something else you could have been doing with that time. And we appreciate that you're even thinking about, or maybe you already have. You might have been one of the people who already have a policy in place, and for making the contributions and taking the time again to join us for today. So thanks to you all. Thanks again, Celine. Hope you
Thanks,
have a good
Eileen.
rest of your day.
Bye.